I have taken as my province to restore to the light the art of exercise, once so highly esteemed, but now dead and forgotten. In his 1569 book, On the Art of Exercise, the Italian physician Girolamo Mercuriale writes in a way that makes you think that just like Botticelli and Michelangelo had rediscovered the art of ancient Greece in Renaissance Italy, he too had rediscovered a lost art, the art of exercise. But was that true? Did people stop exercising with the fall of the Roman Empire? Was there a renaissance of fitness in the 16th century, as it were? What does this book tell us about how people thought of the body and its health during the Renaissance? Let's find out. Hello, lovely history fans. I'm Dr. Julia Martins, and I'm a historian of gender and medicine, and this is Pancake. I'm interested in how people thought about the body in the past and how that shapes the present. If you're new here, welcome to my channel, our channel perhaps, Living History, where I talk about the history of everyday life. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you know when another video is out. I also have a Patreon, and I would be very grateful if you considered supporting my work there and helping me make more history videos. Thank you. Now, like many of you, I'm often bombarded on social media with influencers telling me about the best way to exercise. Is it Pilates, running, weightlifting, whether I'm looking for advice or not. And none of this advice questions whether exercise is good for you. These people are just arguing about how to exercise rather than whether to exercise at all. And most of us would agree that unless you have a specific issue, exercise is usually good for you. That was not the case with Mercuriale, though. He writes as if he's trying to persuade the reader of the value of exercise, which was not a given. Let's go through how the ideas behind exercising had changed from antiquity through the medieval period and how it was rediscovered, or rather reinvented, in the Renaissance. Let's talk about this renaissance of fitness Mercuriale was writing about. He makes some bold claims, for sure, but his book is one of the best sources to understand what people thought about exercise and health in the Renaissance. Plus, he has some advice that can still be helpful today. Let's explore. So, what is exercise? Okay, this may seem like a silly question. We all know what exercise is, right? Or do we? I mean, trust me, this concept has changed a lot over time. For the Roman physician Galen, who I seem to mention in every single video that I make, exercise was vigorous movement, which caused breathing to increase. I mean, that makes sense, right? And this is how Mercuriale defined it some 14 centuries later, clearly influenced by Galen. Exercise is a physical movement that is vigorous and spontaneous, which involves a change in breathing pattern and is undertaken with the aim of keeping healthy or building up a sound constitution. I'm not an athlete or anything, but I think this definition would work today. But there's a big difference here from what Galen had written. Not only is exercise about what happens in the human body, exercise is also about intent. You exercise with the goal of being healthy. This definition starts to explain why Mercuriale thought he was rediscovering something lost. I mean, just think about it. Most of us exercise all the time, whether we realize it or not. We may walk to pick up our children from school, climb the stairs in our house, cycle to work, lift objects around the house, and whatnot. That is also true of people of the past, although of course before the Industrial Revolution, indoor plumbing, and many later technologies that make our lives easier such as cars, people used to do a lot more of this kind of exercise or movement. Just think of washerwomen and the work that went into cleaning clothes. So, taking care of your house and family and going from one place to another involved much more physical activity than today. Plus, many professions required physical effort, like the washerwomen, with working in the fields being perhaps the best example of that. But for Mercuriale, that wasn't really exercise, even if it involved movement. I mean, it was exercise in the common sense of the word, as he wrote, and it had its benefits, but that's not really what he was interested in. Think about this distinction. The idea is that if you're rowing a boat to get across a river, you're not exercising. Rowing is a form of transportation that requires you to use your body. But if you're rowing a boat to make your back and your arms stronger, then you are exercising. This is what Mercuriale wrote about digging. If its purpose is to cultivate the soil and grow fruit, then undoubtedly digging should be called work and labor. But if its aim is health, then it should be called exercise. The same can be said for sports and games, both of which tend to involve competition, whether individually or in groups. Of course, you are exercising when playing tennis, but arguably the main goal is to win the match, with exercise being secondary to the main intent. The word itself first appeared in English in the 14th century, and it was used in connection to farm animals. It literally meant removing restraint, so there's the idea of unrestrained activity and movement. But the person exercising wasn't necessarily the one moving, as we'll see. For instance, Ibn Sina or Avicenna, the prince of physicians, wrote of passive exercise, which should be recommended for those who were ill or convalescing or had a frail constitution. But let's explore how these ideas changed over time. Let's talk about the Greeks. Well, you knew I had to mention Hippocrates at some point in this video, so here it is. Hippocrates, of course, the father of medicine, is known for many things. One of which was for emphasizing the importance of maintaining what we would today call a healthy lifestyle to prevent illness, so preventative medicine. In this period and for centuries after that, the main framework through which Europeans understood medicine was, you guessed it, the humoral theory, which I also mention all the time. I know I mention this in every single video, but stick with me, I promise I'll be quick. So people had 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and it was believed that their imbalance, the imbalance of these humors, was responsible for illness. But humors were, of course, not the only factors in explaining whether someone was healthy or not. And if there were remedies for treating the body, taking care of yourself to avoid becoming ill in the first place was just as vital. One of the most important things to consider to preserve health was what came to be known as the non-naturals, 6 non-natural things which could determine health or lack thereof: food and drink, air, sleep, evacuation, emotions, and exercise and rest. So advice about these non-naturals appears in the Hippocratic corpus, and they were later further developed by Galen in the 2nd century CE. For Hippocrates, eating alone will not keep a man well. He must also exercise. For food and exercise, while possessing opposite qualities, yet work together to produce health. So, to live a healthy life, one should be mindful of diet, exercise and rest, bathing and cleansing your body, etc., following a regimen. Still, when most of us think of exercise in the past, the first thought that comes to mind is often the Olympic Games, which epitomize the ancient culture of athleticism and exercising the body. In this context, the competition was connected to pre-Christian religious rituals. Sacrificing animals and dedicating them to the gods was a part of the rituals in these important occasions. But, thinking of everyday life, most towns in ancient Greece would have had a gymnasium, and the same can be said for the early days of the Roman Empire. But not everyone was welcome. It was reserved for elite men. Women usually weren't even allowed to enter these gymnasia or gyms, not even to watch, let alone exercise, nor were men from lower social strata. So, even though gymnasia were an important part of social life, they weren't like a theater or a marketplace in which different groups of people could potentially mix. So, when Plato wrote that women should exercise as well, he was very much talking about an ideal world, not something that would have happened in his day. And Mercuriale, writing in the Renaissance, is even more lukewarm about the issue. He isn't for or against women exercising, really. He just writes that here is not the place to investigate, using the line that academics would adopt from then on whenever questioned about something missing from their work. It is beyond the scope of this study. Oh well. But let me quickly tell you a little bit about these gymnasia. They tended to be public in the sense that they were owned by the town. They were staffed with trainers, servants, and enslaved people, and administered by a gymnasiarch, the ruler of the gym. There were also some gymnasia owned privately, and people who trained there would pay fees, just like you might pay a gym membership today. The world of gymnasia, Olympic Games, gladiatorial competitions, and all that we came to associate with exercise in the Greco-Roman world wasn't going to last much longer, though. With the rise of Christianity, gladiatorial games were increasingly criticized. I mean, Constantine the Great, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianism, even attempted to ban gladiatorial games in 325 CE, even though in practice they continued in many places. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Olympic Games were in decline too, and by the time of Theodosius II, the Olympic Games were mostly a thing of the past. I think it would be too simplistic to say that cathedrals were replacing gymnasia and that the focus of the sacred moved from the body to the soul with Christianity, even if that is partly true. There are many reasons for this shift besides the rise of Christianity, which I won't go into here. And none of this happened overnight. But suffice it to say that a new era was beginning, one in which, although exercise was still largely considered beneficial to health, it arguably wasn't as celebrated as it had once been, which is why Mercuriale wrote in the 16th century that this art was now extinct. Still, throughout the medieval period, guides for healthy living, regimens of health, continued to be an important part of medical literature, with advice written by physicians about what constituted a healthy lifestyle. And these guides relied on writings by the ancient authorities, plus medieval physicians such as Ibn Sina. So, exercise was believed to have many benefits, such as strengthening the limbs, aiding in digestion because it heated the body, improving the function of organs, facilitating the distribution of nourishment around the body, helping the body expel waste through the opening of the pores and sweat, distributing bodily heat, consuming superfluous matter and fluids in the body, and many others. But there was no consensus in the literature. If Galen had valued the importance of vigorous exercise, that changed breathing, which makes sense when you remember that he worked as a surgeon with gladiators at the beginning of his career. Later physicians argued that moderation was superior. Ugo Benzi, a professor of medicine at the University of Padua, wrote that people should exercise in moderation, avoiding what induces heavy breathing and overheating. Galen had listed in De Sanitate Tuenda examples of strenuous activities such as racing, hunting, wrestling, ball games, and even work-related activities such as plowing and shipbuilding. Later, in the 11th century, Ibn Sina stressed that this activity should be undertaken for its own sake, and it should be voluntary, which would enhance its benefits. So he drew a line between physically demanding activities and labor and exercise, whether undertaken for medical, athletic, or recreational reasons. And it's this idea that Mercuriale will come back to in the Renaissance. In any case, exercise should be adapted to each person's needs and constitution, like most recommendations in a regimen. Things like the season, age, the time of day, and how often the person bathed should all be considered. This exercise could be active, such as swimming or walking, but it could also be passive movement, as I mentioned earlier in Ibn Sina's writings. Being transported in a carriage or a boat was therefore considered exercise. So there were many alternatives to attain similar results for your health if you couldn't go for a run, including baths and massages, and that sounds much nicer, doesn't it? Arguably, in many medical texts of the Renaissance, exercise seems to be integrated into everyday activities, and moderation seems to be the key. Physicians worried about the detrimental effects of excessive exercise, which could overheat the body and even accelerate aging, believe it or not, as it would weaken the body. So, vigorous exercise tended to only be recommended to boys and men between 14 and 21 years old. In any case, when Mercuriale sat down to write his book on exercise in 16th century Italy, gymnasia following the Greco-Roman model were long gone, as were the games for which athletes had so meticulously prepared. These buildings were abandoned and in ruins, and perhaps the baths of Caracalla are the best example of this. And while people could lead very physically demanding lives and physicians did write about exercise and recommended it to their patients, Mercuriale felt that this was not enough. Just like artists had rediscovered Greco-Roman sculpture, architecture, and paintings, it was time for the lost art of exercise to be celebrated once more. But how did it happen that Mercuriale would set out on this project? Well, first things first. Girolamo Mercuriale was born in Forlì, in what is today the Romagna region in Italy. Following in the footsteps of his father, he went on to study medicine in places such as Bologna, Venice, and Padua. By the way, that's where Andreas Vesalius, who revolutionized anatomy, had taught. Mercuriale was clearly an ambitious man, and he started writing medical texts, including one on babies and children, in which he criticized wet nurses, and he advocated for mothers to breastfeed their own children. Wet nursing, or hiring someone to breastfeed your children, was a common practice in this period. So that just goes to show how Mercuriale wasn't afraid of controversy, and he was just 22 years old. He went back to his hometown and, in a diplomatic trip to Rome in the 1560s, Mercuriale met Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, a grandson of the late Pope Paul III. The cardinal came from a powerful and wealthy family and could open many doors for the young doctor. But, and that's one of my favorite things about him, what Mercuriale wanted was access to books. He read the classics in the Vatican Library, especially books on medicine. Plus, he explored the private and wonderful library of the Farnese family. It was during this time that he seems to have fallen in love with the Greco-Roman world. If classical philosophy and art were the pinnacle of what the human mind could achieve, why wouldn't it be the same for the body? Why shouldn't humanists also celebrate exercise as a core principle of this glorious past? And so, Mercuriale wrote the Arte Gymnastica in 1569, which was re-edited 4 years later to include illustrations and extra material. This wasn't a regimen, but an overview of exercise in ancient Greece and Rome. The book was dedicated to, who else? Cardinal Farnese, and it set out to be an atlas, a reference book of a forgotten classical art, as well as a plea for restoring this lost art to its pristine splendor and ancient dignity, as Mercuriale termed it. So this was going to be a Renaissance update of a Greco-Roman guide to health and fitness, an encyclopedia of exercise dating back to antiquity, with balance and moderation at its core. It's important to say that despite his bold claims of reinventing or rediscovering this lost art, another book had already been published on this matter, over a decade earlier. And I'm not even thinking of manuscripts here, just printed books.
Still, the 1553 Libro del Ejercicio by the Spanish physician Cristobal Mendez was much shorter and didn't have nearly as much impact.
Mercuriale was made famous by his book, in part perhaps because of the way it is written. He argues passionately in favor of exercise throughout the 6 parts of the book, covering some activities we would easily classify as exercise today, and others which might be a bit more puzzling. Here are some of them. So there's walking. He was a big fan of walking, wrestling, jumping, boxing, swimming, and running. So far so good, right? But there's more. Laughing and crying are listed as well. I mean, perhaps they could work your abs? I don't know. Plus holding your breath. I mean, I guess that would be useful training for other activities such as diving. I'm not sure. But the way the book is organized is very compelling and it's just fun to read. There's a statement with examples and it's backed by ancient writers. Mercuriale's favorite seems to have been Galen, I can relate to that, and he quotes Galen 40 times in just the first 100 pages of the book. And Mercuriale has his moments of sounding like a gym bro and giving this tough love to his readers. He wrote, "Exercise can sometimes be hard, and when it is being performed, unpleasant. But good health is not incompatible with some discomfort." So no pain, no gain, Renaissance version. I mean, I love that. I think spin instructors everywhere should take notes. But readers shouldn't be intimidated. He writes, "Everyone should begin with a relaxed and gentle exercise, increasing its intensity gradually." Very reasonable. There were 3 kinds of exercise, or 3 parts to exercise, according to Mercuriale. The preliminary part, so kind of like a warm-up, the simple, which was the main activity, and the terminal bit, so sort of like a cool-down. But before all that, you should clean the body, comb the hair, wash the hands and face, and dress appropriately, meaning wearing clothes that allow movement, yet keep the body protected from the air and excessive temperatures. Of course, this advice reminds us that, regardless of Mercuriale's love for ancient Greece, we're not in an ancient gymnasium anymore where athletes would train naked. I mean, gymnastics translates as exercising in the nude, and that was the standard for centuries. But this is the 16th century. Having said that, Mercuriale wrote with admiration of these gymnasia as large public buildings with outdoor space in a specific part of the city, writing of their size that the capacity of these places was so large, their area so great in extent, that it was possible to carry out without any hindrance innumerable exercises of diverse types, of both body and mind. Yes, so he reminds us that philosophy and athleticism weren't incompatible but complementary. Plato and Aristotle debated philosophical matters in these gymnasia. Mercuriale was probably inspired by the text De Architectura, or On Architecture, written around 25 BCE by the Roman architect Marcus Vitruvius. Vitruvius described what a proper gym should be like, including, beyond an area for exercising, a place for relaxation and contemplation, plus bathing. I mean, it sounds lovely. But if Mercuriale believed exercise should be restored to its former glory, he maintained that the main goal of exercise should be health. It wasn't about vanity or appearance, even though we know that these things tend to be connected, including in the Renaissance. He wrote, "Strength is very different from good health. People who worried excessively about developing strength and toning their muscles produced minds and senses that are dull, torpid, and slow." Mercuriale didn't hold back, writing that focusing on the body's appearance was perverting the very art he sought to restore. Even to aspire to such a body would be a perversion of the art of gymnastics. Basically, you shouldn't exercise to enhance your beauty, but your health. Those who exercise moderately and appropriately can lead a healthy life that does not depend on any remedies, but those who do so without proper care are wrecked by perpetual ill health and require constant medication. Coming back to 21st century influences inundating our feeds with tricks and tips about how to narrow our waist and define our legs, I find reading Mercuriale quite refreshing. Maybe he was onto something, even if he thought including women in this conversation was somewhat irrelevant. It's also likely, though, that because he was writing about exercise in general, focusing on men would have made more sense to him, as men were seen as sort of the default. We don't even get any insights into his personal diet or exercise routines, as he's establishing universal principles rather than taking an interest in any specifics. His book was a success, and it was probably partly why Mercuriale had been offered a position as personal physician to the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II. This was a time in which medicine was quickly changing. Anatomy, especially thanks to Vesalius, was increasingly popular as a branch of study. Medical reformers, such as the Swiss physician Paracelsus, were arguing for a new kind of medicine, in which chemistry was central. Still, while there were forward-looking trends like these, there was also a humanist interest in rediscovering and rethinking the classical tradition, focusing on Galen and Hippocrates. Mercuriale would go on to translate Hippocratic texts and to teach medicine at the University of Padua and Bologna. He would write many other books in his lifetime, including on cosmetics, diseases of women, yay, skin conditions, and the plague. And this was after his disastrous handling of an outbreak earlier. Apparently, he had learned something from the experience. Anyway. And then later, when he died in Forlì, he was an old man accomplished in medicine at 76 years old. Did people really stop exercising with the fall of the Roman Empire? And did they start exercising again in the Renaissance, thanks to Mercuriale and his rediscovery of this lost art? Of course not. Nor was his book written in isolation, but as a part of a broader conversation within medicine. There's much more that could be said about the relationship between exercise and health, especially in this period. But Mercuriale had a big impact on the way people thought about the body and health. In the 1581 book, Positions Concerning the Training Up of Children, by an English headmaster, Richard Mulcaster, he advocated for exercise to be a part of the school curriculum, essentially for pupils to receive physical education, PE, citing Mercuriale's work. Mulcaster was a part of Queen Elizabeth I's circle, and he may have known Shakespeare. In fact, it is said that the schoolmaster in Love's Labour's Lost is based on him, but don't quote me on that. By the way, you didn't think that I would make a video without mentioning Shakespeare, did you? That was not happening. Anyway, in any case, that just goes to show how influential Mercuriale's writing was. Mercuriale advocated for the importance of exercise to the body's health, and although it's clear reading him that he didn't have women in mind, nor people from the lower ranks of society, it's not a very inclusive book to be sure, his aim of restoring exercise to its former Greco-Roman glory is often left out of narratives about the Renaissance. We tend to remember Michelangelo and Da Vinci, Botticelli and Donatello, but there were other sides to the Renaissance as well. Mercuriale laid down the foundation for sports medicine, for physical therapy, for physical education in schools, and so it's worth remembering him. His structure of warm-up, workout, cool-down is still how most of us exercise today, and if some of his advice is outdated and based on older ideas about the body, some of it stands the test of time really well, such as the idea of adapting exercise to your own body and doing things in moderation. Maybe some influencers out there should take note, just saying. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, that always helps with the algorithm, and do consider subscribing to the channel if you're interested in videos about history. If you would like to help me keep on making these videos, please consider supporting my work over on Patreon. It truly does help. Thank you and see you next time.